Good evening. Welcome to the 2016 Jacobson Global Lecture Series. My name is Joyce Kennedy, and I'm the Director of Community Relations here at Concordia College. We have a very exciting fall season scheduled, and it's not just because of the topic of our guest speaker we'll discuss in a few minutes. We also have a number of interesting programs at Concordia in the next few weeks, and I want to quickly tell you about them. October 22nd at 4 p.m. back here in the Sommer Center is the inauguration ceremony of our 9th president, the Reverend Dr. John Nunes. On Tuesday, October 25th, our business breakfast series will feature Paul Wilson, Senior Vice President of Olympic Sales at NBC Universal, who will talk about the business of NBC Olympics and its unmatched marketing power. November 2nd at 6:15 is our 35th annual community dinner. This year's honoree is Judy Foley, who's with us tonight. Judy, where are you? Thank you. So we encourage all of you to please join us on that special evening. November 4th, Michael Fosina, who is the president of New York Presbyterian Lawrence Hospital, will talk about the current state of health care. Both of these events, this event will be at 7 a.m. in the Petrusky Auditorium. Saturday, November 5th at 7 p.m., again back here in Sommer Center, our popular Slaburski film series returns with a showing of The Ghosts of Amistad, followed by a discussion led by Ken Davis, Concordia alumnus and author of the recently published book, In the Shadow of Liberty, the story of 4 presidents and 5 black lives. November 17th, Books and Coffee again will host local resident Brian Featherstone, who will discuss his book, The Long View, Career Strategies to Start Strong, Reach High, and Go Far. We hope you will join us for these events, which are always free and open to the public. Now I'd like to turn the podium over to Dr. James Berkey, Vice Provost of Graduate and Online Education here at Concordia, who will introduce tonight's special guest.
Good evening, friends. Nights like this evening are always an opportunity to welcome back to Concordia old friends, and tonight is no exception. So I'd like to take a moment to recognize one such friend of Concordia, Kate Jacobson, wife to... Kate, would you please stand? Kate, wife to our late provost, Dr. David Jacobson, for whom this series was named. So thank you for being here tonight, Kate. And now to our speaker. The notoriously cranky humorist and critic H.L. Mencken said that a national campaign is better than the best circus anyone's ever heard of. And if you know Mencken, you know that that's the kindest thing he had to say about American politics. In this circus-like atmosphere, I can't think of a better time to address a subject, as with tonight's lecture, Division, Disinterest, and Democracy in America, Contours of the 2016 Election. Dr. Costas Panagopoulos, tonight's speaker, is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for Electoral Politics and Democracy at Fordham University. He's a leading expert on campaign elections, voting behavior, media, public opinion, campaign strategy, campaign finance, and has been part of the decision desk team at NBC News since the 2006 election cycle. Dr. Panagopoulos is co-author of A Citizen's Guide to U.S. Elections, Empowering Democracy in America. He has served as visiting professor of political science at Yale University and is a frequent commentator and analyst for major national news programs and writes for newspapers. I could go on with his many accomplishments, but like you, I'm very eager to hear what he has to say about this historic, bizarre election cycle. And I'm also very thankful that he's with us tonight. So please join me in welcoming Costas Panagopoulos.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank Mrs. Jacobson and President Nunes for being here this evening, as well as Dr. Berkey. And also, on a personal note, Jim Bunn and Joyce, who coordinated the invitation and the logistics and have worked really hard to put this together. So it's really a pleasure to be here. And and to talk about this fascinating election cycle. I'm also pleased to know that we're in the Sommer Worship and Performing Arts Center, because since I guess we're in the Performing Arts Center, it'll be really convenient to just go right next door after the lecture and say a prayer for our country by the time this is over with. And I might ask the good Lord, given that opportunity, whether he put Donald Trump in this election to torture political scientists, because everything that we thought, lots of what we thought we knew about politics and elections has been completely overturned, or is in the process of at least being overturned, or at least questioned with this election cycle. So we've got a lot of thinking to do after it's all over. But for now and for tonight, what I'd like to do is share some observations with you about how this all happened and what might happen in a few weeks on Election Day. And to contextualize that in the framework of broader trends that are going on and have been going on over the past few decades in American politics, and think through with you some of the implications of those patterns and those developments. So as I was grappling with the title for this lecture, this is what we came up with, but an alternative might have easily been, maybe I'll use this microphone so that I can see my slides as we're going through them here. Let's see. Okay. There it is. As Hillary Clinton herself wondered, why isn't she 50 points ahead? Right? There might be some pretty good reasons for that, and maybe we'll get to that as the night goes on. But for now, we'll start with the main attraction in this presidential cycle, which is Donald Trump. Who is Donald Trump? And think about how he actually managed to get where he is and to win the Republican nomination against many odds and defying lots of people's expectations, including my own and most of my colleagues, and most professional experts and analysts who, at the very beginning, were very skeptical that he had any potential to go on and to claim the Republican nomination. So I'd like to think about some potential explanations for this development. And I think the first place I would start is to think about how media coverage and attention directed toward Donald Trump might have influenced the outcome of the Republican nomination. Right? In some ways, I think a lot of what we're seeing, particularly with respect to Donald Trump, has a lot to do with his celebrity status, but also with his knowledge of the media, his experience with the media, and his ability, I think this is sometimes underestimated, his ability to be able to find ways of basically attracting considerable media attention, and with that comes name recognition, credibility potentially, and an opportunity to continue to introduce himself and reintroduce himself to the American public in a way that familiarity may in and of itself breed some type of support for him as a presidential candidate. What's fascinating about Donald Trump, these charts, I'm going to present quite a few of these data points throughout the presentation, is that these are the candidates in the Republican primary, as well as Sanders and Clinton on the Democratic side. What these data show is spending in millions of dollars on paid advertising during the presidential nominations through March 15th of 2016. And free media, the value of free media in millions of dollars for each of these candidates. And what you see is, on the Democratic side, Hillary Clinton, who spent almost as much, well, exactly as much as Bernie Sanders did in paid advertising over the course of the election cycle through March, $28 million each, had managed to get quite a bit more media coverage. Her
her earned media or her free media was about 2-to-1, a little more than 2-to-1 advantage over Bernie Sanders. But if you look at Donald Trump's free media advantage, it was just astronomical. He managed to get almost $2 billion worth of free media just through March of the primary campaign, even though he only spent $10 million. Right? Now that might cause us to question the role of money in politics and the concerns that we have about the lavish spending in politics. This is a fraction of what we see candidates spending in presidential nominations. It's a tiny amount, especially to have generated this kind of free media coverage. So think about what it would have taken for him to actually purchase or pay for $2 billion. I'm not sure that even Donald Trump would be able to come up with that kind of money, and yet that is what he was able to attract, which basically sucked all of the oxygen out of the air for the other Republican candidates, making it very, very difficult for any of them to get the kind of traction. You can see that Carson got about $112 million worth of free media. He only spent about $5 million of his own money, but it's still swamped by the kind of free media that Trump is getting over the course. And this, incidentally, has continued if you have followed this since March. But I think this has a lot to do with his early success. Beyond that, and to reinforce that point, some evidence from my colleagues John Sides and Lynn Vavrick, professors at George Washington University and UCLA, tracks Trump's dominance in news coverage from May of 2015 until January of the election year. And what these data show is the share of media attention, or the percent of mentions in TV news coverage for Donald Trump compared to the other GOP candidates. And what you see is that he's regularly getting more than half of the media coverage in the presidential primary on the Republican side over most of this period, which we call the invisible primary, the period before which any actual voting in primaries and caucuses happens, but which turns out to be important for other reasons, because this is when voters are being introduced to the candidates. This is when they're working behind the scenes to attract the support of party leaders and the press, etc. So this turns out to be a very important period, and over the course of this period, particularly after he announced in June of 2015, he's once again not only grabbing most of the media attention, but at points at which his attention in the media starts to dwindle, he very cleverly does things or says things that automatically shift the focus right back to his candidacy. So you can see here, here's his attack of McCain, which caused his short-term media attention to spike again. Here's his discussion of the Muslim, the database of Muslims, the Muslim ban, right? You could see that these events took place at strategic points during the race, points at which he was struggling to maintain the kind of media and news attention that he was getting. As soon as this would happen, he would say something, tweet something, do something that basically got the focus right back on him and his campaign. So it's one of the reasons why he may have ended up with the kind of free media advantage, because it's clear that he was able to use the media to his advantage by doing these sorts of things, and the media just kind of went along with it. Maybe because it was good for ratings, maybe because it was controversial, and we know that the emphasis in the media these days, they love controversy, etc. But these things did not happen, I think they did not happen haphazardly, right? They happened in very strategic ways. Now, why should we care about all this news media coverage? Well, one of the reasons we should care about it is because there is a correlation between the amount of news coverage and support in the polls, okay? So if we can see this positive correlation here for the other candidates, it's positive and you know, roughly in this area, but look where Donald Trump is, up here, right? Way ahead of any of the other Republican candidates in terms of the relationship between his news coverage and his standing in the polls. So he was able to translate all that advantage into support in the polls, which signaled something about his credibility. Other potential explanations. Well, one other important aspect of this race that we have got to think about or talk about is the way that group identity politics has been playing out in his campaign and in this election. There is a considerable amount of anxiety amongst whites about growing multiculturalism in this country. Okay. Here's some survey evidence from 2010 that shows that almost 2/3 of the white population expresses at least some concern, some anxiety about the fact that the ethnic makeup and the racial makeup of the United States is changing. People seem to be very aware of the fact that by 2044, the United States will be a majority-minority nation, right? Less than half of the population is projected to be non-Hispanic white at this point. And whites have some anxiety about this, right? Now, that is not exactly the same thing as saying that they are racist. And I think that this is a distinction that is worth pointing out. Plenty of these whites have score high on racial resentment. However, if you look at these two figures here, put together by Ashley Jardinia, who is a political scientist at Duke University, what you see is, here's the level of racial resentment on the x-axis here. You see how many people fall into this category, and this is amongst individuals who score very high in terms of how important their white identity is to them. And this is amongst people for whom their connection to their identity as whites is moderate or low. You do see that for those who score high in terms of identifying with their identity as whites, their level of racial resentment does tend to be higher. However, you also see similar patterns even amongst those people who are moderate or low white identifiers, right? All of this to say that white identity or connection to white citizens' identity as whites is distinct from characteristics of racial resentment or racism, right? It's a different thing. And one of the things that could be fueling Trump's support is not only potentially racial resentment, but also this other thing, this related thing, but also this different thing of strong white identity, which comes potentially from threat that whites feel about growing multiculturalism and anxiety that they're feeling about the knowledge that in a few years whites will be a minority in this country. And they have anxiety about that. And if you look at Trump's support, it's hard to see these charts, but if you look at white racial identity, right, on the x-axis here, as you go to the right, these are individuals for whom their white racial identity is extremely important. These are individuals for whom it's not important at all. You see this very clear pattern in terms of intention to vote for Trump in the primaries. The more important one's white racial identity is, the more likely they were to indicate that they were going to vote for Trump in the primary. When they were concerned about discrimination against whites, those people for whom, or who had a great deal of concern about discrimination against whites were much more likely than those people who had no concern about discrimination toward whites to indicate that they were going to vote for Trump. Those individuals who felt it was extremely likely that whites were losing jobs to minorities were much more likely to vote, to indicate that they're going to vote for Trump compared to those people for whom they thought that minorities were not likely, whites were not likely to be losing their jobs to minorities, and even those for whom, those who believed it was extremely important for whites to be working together to change the laws, hard to see. But anyway, the patterns there are all the same, right? That those people who score high on those measures were the ones who were most likely to express support for Trump in the primaries and even in more recent polls for the general election. So there's something to group identity politics that is manifesting itself, playing itself out in the context of the current presidential election cycle, and especially with respect to Donald Trump. But Donald Trump did not cause this to happen. Okay? These are patterns and trends that have been happening in American politics long before Trump. And these are some data points here looking at Republican vote intentions for president from 1992 to 2012, long before Trump, by looking at the difference between black and white negative stereotypes. And what you see is the slope of this line has progressively gotten more and more steep, suggesting that this is becoming more and more strong a relationship over time. And it's clearly gotten even stronger in the 2016 cycle, but these patterns were in place long before Donald Trump. There's also, it's also fair to acknowledge, as many analysts have pointed out, that there's a considerable amount of anger and frustration or disillusionment, whatever you want to call it, in the electorate. Ironically, this is happening at a time when the index of consumer sentiment is actually pretty strong, right? Our perceptions of what's going on with the economy, maybe not for everyone, but in general in the electorate, is pretty positive, right? Here's 2016 right here. You can see it certainly is quite a bit better than 2011, 2012. However, political support for political institutions does not exhibit this kind of trend. You can see here that the percent who trust government just about always to do what's right is pretty much flat over this period. Percent saying the country's going in the right direction is more or less flat. The percent who say that they are satisfied with the way things are going in the United States is more or less flat. Okay, so in terms of thinking about the economy or the nature of the times or the situation in the country, although consumer sentiment is on the rise, these other indicators are flat or not really on the rise. So I think that is a potential explanation as well. And finally, I think that it's important to point out that one of the reasons why, or one of the explanations for why Donald Trump was able to do as well as he did in the Republican nomination is that the Republican Party was in disarray, could not coalesce behind some other candidate. Usually, this happens during the period I alluded to during the invisible primary. Okay? There's a thesis in political science called the party decides, right? The party leaders basically get together and figure out who they're going to support, and they put these signals out there. They put these signals out there by providing endorsements for candidates. They put these signals out there by providing money to candidates, and people pick up on these cues and they respond to them, and eventually those candidates which the party decides are going to be viable or preferred are the ones who end up getting the nominations for parties. That didn't happen on the Republican side in 2016. So you can see here, so this is some recent, this is the percentage of governors, senators, and U.S. House members that endorsed a candidate for president. Here are Democrats in the in the year before the election. So this is the percent of these people who endorsed candidates in the first quarter, the second quarter of the election year, the third quarter, and the fourth quarter of the election year, or the year preceding the election. And this is, on the Republican side, what happened. What you see is in 2016, Democrats clearly fell behind very early on Hillary Clinton, right? So almost 30% of Democratic governors, senators, and U.S. House members had already endorsed Hillary Clinton a whole year before the election. So in January of 2015, I don't even think Bernie Sanders had even, maybe it wasn't even a candidate at the time, had already endorsed Hillary Clinton. So you see that this is clear, and she didn't win the nomination in 2008, but you see that in 2008, only about half of those people had endorsed Barack Obama at the same time period. This is 2016 on the Republican side, right? Hardly anyone, even just before the voting actually started in the primaries, fewer than half of the governors, Republican governors, senators, and U.S. House members had endorsed a candidate for the Republican nomination, okay? So the party leaders were just not getting together and sending signals to the electorate about who they should be supporting as their nominee. And in the absence of that, people made the choice for the party. And by the time the party figured out, well, maybe we shouldn't be throwing our support behind Donald Trump for whatever reason, if they felt that, it was too late to do anything about it, okay? So it was a runaway train at that point, and of course this is, you know, who voters decided should get the nomination, but they did that in the absence of cues from party leaders, unlike on the Democratic side. So those are some of the leading explanations for how Donald Trump, in my mind anyway, for how Donald Trump may have actually managed to become the nominee. Now let's think about what might happen, and let's take a step back to consider the broader political landscape. One of the things that we could think about is partisanship and trends in partisan identity in this country, the degree to which people indicate a connection to one or the other of the major parties or feel a sense of attachment to the political parties. Here's some data on partisanship in the U.S. electorate from 1952 to 2008. These patterns are basically similar if we extend this to 2016. This is Democratic partisanship, Republican partisanship, and this is the number of what we call pure independents, those people who do not identify with either of the political parties. A few things to point out. One is that for this entire period, Democrats have always had an advantage in terms of partisanship, partisan affiliation. Okay? So if everyone voted, and they voted the way that they claim to identify, Democrats should win every election in this period, right? They don't, because Democrats and Republicans vote at different rates, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But anyway, these are the differences, and you can see how big the advantage is, and I'll get to 2016 numbers in a minute. But the other thing to point out is that the number of pure independents, those people who even when push comes to shove, they really don't affiliate with one party or another, is really only about 10 or 15% on average. Okay? Now, Gallup will tell you that 42% of the electorate claims to be independent, which is the highest number of independents they have registered since they've been polling. However, most of those people actually lean toward one party or the other. In fact, even when they claim to be independents, when you look at their positions on issues, those people who lean toward the Democratic Party look very much like Democrats, and those people who lean toward the Republican Party look very much like Republicans. So the number of pure independents is actually fairly limited, and may have very different characteristics than you might anticipate. This is not just all young people, for example, although a higher share of young people identify as independents, but the pure independents, those people who really don't lean toward one party or the other, they tend to be very highly educated, they tend to be white, middle-aged men, and many of them live in the Midwest and in the South. And that's the profile of most pure independents in this country, many of whom are now supporting Donald Trump. We'll see if that's enough. But anyway, it gives you a sense of the distribution of partisanship in the electorate. You would get a very different picture if you lumped in the independents without taking into consideration whether they lean toward one of the parties or the other. So for example, in 2012, 33% said that they were independents, 28% claimed to be Republican, 35% claimed to be Democratic. You see the Democratic advantage still, but this number looks higher than 10 or 15% only because we're not subtracting from that the people who actually lean toward one party or the other. You can also see some differences in terms of what's happening over time between 2008 and 2012. The Republican Party is making gains among working class white voters. You can see here where those shifts are happening and where the Republican advantage is. In 2008, Republicans had a 2-point advantage amongst white voters, whereas by 2012, that had increased sixfold to a 12-point advantage in the electorate. So you see some big changes here, especially amongst men, amongst those voters 30 to 49, amongst those voters making between $30,000 and $75,000, and those people without a college education. So you see that the advantage in 2008 amongst voters with no college education was only 3% of the electorate for that election cycle, but by 2012 it had grown to a 17-point advantage, and in 2016 it's actually even wider than that. Here's a profile of the bases for each of the political parties. What you see is that for the Republican Party, 87% of its base is comprised of white voters, whereas for the Democratic Party, it's only 61% of its base that's actually white, 21% of the Democratic base is black, 10% is Hispanic. Democrats actually have a 2-to-1 advantage over Republicans when it comes to the percentage of their base that's Hispanic. Now, given the demographic changes that I alluded to a moment ago, and given that Hispanics are the fastest growing segment of the minority electorate, that could be a big gap, not only in this election cycle, but in subsequent election cycles, provided they can field candidates that will not cause those voters to move away, withdraw from the party. Anyway, some additional data here about those patterns. Partisanship is also becoming, I'll show you some of the other ways here in which partisanship might be manifesting itself in elections. This is the percentage of people who actually split their tickets in presidential elections between 1952 and 2008, between presidential and House races. So these are people who voted for the president of one party, but for members of the House in the other party. You can see that that was almost as much of a third of the electorate in the early 70s. That has dwindled down to less than 20% in more recent election cycles. So it suggests that people are not splitting their tickets, or they're splitting their tickets less and less as time goes on. So it seems to be the case that partisanship is actually being strengthened in the electorate. And most people actually make up their mind about who they're going to vote for long before the election, long before we even know who the candidates are, right? So you see here data on the timing of the voting decision from 1948 to 2004, anywhere from 35 to 60% of the electorate, but most voters knew how they were going to vote all along, or when the candidates announced, right? The campaign didn't even have to start, right? There's nothing that happened in the campaign for a lot of these voters that caused them to abandon these initial preferences. And you see that only a small number of people make up their mind either in the last 2 weeks of the campaign or on election day. So a lot of these conditions, a lot of these things are already in place long before the election even starts. Some of the other broad patterns that are important and relevant. Clearly, polarization. What do we mean by partisan polarization? This is the degree to which Democrats and Republicans are becoming further and further apart on issues or on ideology in this country. And that can be explored with respect to elected officials and politicians, but also the electorate as a whole. So if you look at the degree of partisan polarization in Congress over time, from the 1800s to 2012, you see that since the 1940s, party polarization in both the House and the Senate. That means the ideological distance between your average Democrat and your average Republican has been growing. Here's the data in a different way for the House. In the Republican Party, with this extreme on the y-axis being the most conservative and this being the most liberal, what you see is that Republicans in the House are moving closer and closer to the ideological conservative extreme, whereas Democrats are moving in the other direction, closer and closer to the liberal ideological extreme. And you see the same pattern if you look at the Senate. A steady a steady climb toward the extremes in both parties, but in particular amongst the Republican Party in the U.S. Senate. But you also see the same pattern in the opposite direction for Democratic senators over a very long period. Looking at it a different way, if you just look at the percentage of moderate legislators in the U.S. Congress over time, you see that this has dwindled since the 1940s. So those people who are actually moderates are virtually non-existent. At the same time, and over corresponding periods, party unity, or the degree to which Democrats vote with other Democrats and Republicans vote with other Republicans consistently in Congress over this period, has also been on the climb in both the House and the Senate. So you have strengthening partisanship, strengthening party unity, much more homogeneity within the parties in Congress in terms of what's happening. And you also see that in the electorate, right? So these are the median points for your average Democrat and your average Republican in the electorate, not so much in Congress, but in the electorate amongst voters as a whole. You see that this gap was not very wide in 1994. In other words, your average Democrat was not very different from your average Republican. By 2004, 10 years later, it started to get a little bit wider, and by 2014, it was considerably wider than it had been in the previous period. So both legislators and the public are getting more and more ideologically extreme or polarized over this period, and that has an effect for what we're seeing play out in elections over this period. You also see a strong correspondence between partisan identification and how people vote. If you look at what happened in 2012, 92% of Democrats voted for Obama, 93% of Republicans voted for Romney. Right? So only small fractions of people who identify with one party or the other are actually switching sides, and we're seeing similar patterns in 2016. So it just makes it very difficult to get crossover support in such a polarized atmosphere in which partisanship is playing a stronger and stronger role. What does participation have to do with all of this? Well, here are some data on voter turnout in presidential elections. That's this line right here, and midterm elections over this period. What do we see? Well, we see that turnout in presidential elections has been growing a bit in recent cycles. It wasn't as low as it previously had been in the late 90s. But on average, about 40% of the eligible electorate is still not participating in presidential elections, and only about 40% or so on average are voting in midterm elections. Now, this has implications because the kind of people who vote in presidential elections are very different from the kinds of people who vote in midterm elections. And it's one of the reasons why you see some Democratic advantage in presidential cycles, but a disadvantage in midterm cycles. Here are some reasons that people give for not voting. Some evidence from surveys from 2012. Most people who didn't vote said they didn't vote because they were too busy or they had a conflicting schedule. But 16%, that's almost 1 in 5 voters, said they were just not interested. And that might cause us to worry about the health and quality of our democracy when almost 1 in 5 voters say they're not even interested, or 13% who said they didn't like the candidates or the campaign issues. Right? So then you have these people. 4% said they just forgot to vote. Here are some differences in turnout by demographic groups in the 2008 election. You don't see very big differences. You don't see much of a gender gap, although there's a little bit of a gender gap. You do see a bigger gap with respect within some racial groups. So for example, only 50% of Hispanics voted in 2008 compared to 66% of non-Hispanic whites or 65% of blacks in that cycle. Also, Asians voted at an even lower rate than Hispanics, right? Which is also interesting to note. You also see big differences when it comes to age. Over 70% of people over 55 voted, compared to only 49% of those 18 to 24 in the 2008 cycle. Education plays a big role. 83% of those with an advanced degree voted in 2008 compared to only 39% of those with a high school degree. And of course, income, 80% of those who make $100,000 or more annually, family income voted compared to 52% of those who make $20,000 or less. So you see these big differences across income, across education, age, and even racial categories, and these translate into advantages or disadvantages for candidates and parties, so they are important. One of the reasons why people vote or not vote is because they're either asked to or not. And we have seen a steady increase since the 50s in major party contact. In other words, being contacted by a political party and asked to vote. Either someone knocks on your door, calls you, sends you a letter, whatever it is. 40% of voters in 2008 were contacted by a major party. But what you see is that those people on the Democratic side and the Republican side is increasingly those people who are most likely to be contacted are those people who are what we call strong partisans, strong affiliates. You see that the lines here are not as steep for independent voters or people who do not affiliate with one party or another. So increasingly these people are left out of the process. No one's knocking on their door, no one's calling them. And for all the talk that we hear about how important independent voters are in elections, that is not what's happening with respect to campaign mobilization by the parties and candidates themselves. They are less likely than strong partisans to be contacted and mobilized. So when it comes to mobilization, there's much greater emphasis on getting out the base than there is on getting out swing voters or getting out people who might cross over and support a candidate of the other party. These charts basically make the same point. Okay, so very strong importance for partisanship, and earlier I talked about group identities, but increasingly political scientists are starting to think of partisan identity as an identity. We used to think that our partisan affiliation was a function of our ideology, of our issue preferences, right? That's what makes us a Democrat or a Republican. It's whether we're liberal or conservative or whether we feel a certain way about a set of issues, and that translates into which party that we identify with. Increasingly, partisanship is being viewed as a social identity, right? It's part of who we are as social beings. And we're very protective of that social identity. It's not so much necessarily just a function of what we believe on issues, but who we are as social beings. And a recent book by Chris Aiken and Larry Bartels argues that identities are not primarily about adherence to a group ideology or creed. They're emotional attachments that transcend thinking. And if you think about that for a minute, it might answer why we're seeing the kind of developments we're seeing this year and what might actually happen in November if people really are reacting emotionally on the basis of their social identity as partisans of either one camp or the other. We see that manifesting itself as partisan bias, or what we call motivated reasoning and facts, right? So here's just some factual information. When we asked people in 1988 to compare whether, or to indicate whether inflation had gotten better, stayed the same, or gotten worse since 1980, the reality was very clear, right? Inflation had gotten much lower, right? In 1980, it was 13.5%. By 1988, it had dwindled down to 4%. But 47% of strong Democrats gave the correct answer. Only 8%, sorry, 47% of strong Republicans gave the right answer, but only 8% of strong Democrats said that inflation had gotten much better. Right? They were motivated to view this through the prism of their partisan identity. And even in 2006, 3 years after the Iraq invasion, 41% of Republicans believed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, compared to only 7% of Democrats. 63% of Republicans thought that Iraq was linked to Al-Qaeda, compared to only 35% of Democrats. So we seem to be making up our own facts on the basis of our partisan identities as well. Some hope is that when you ask people how interested they are in elections or whether they care a great deal about which party wins the election, since the 1980s we do see a little bit of an increase in that, so we could take some consolation in the fact that people are reporting that they are caring a little bit more and interested in elections, so that's some good news. Okay, so what does all this mean for the 2016 election? This is basically backdrop for what I really want to share with you, but it makes the point that the contours of the 2016 election are largely set firmly in place going into this election or any election cycles. So what I'm showing you here is one way in which political science forecasters think about election outcomes. They use statistical models to forecast what's going to happen. And this is a set of statistical forecasts predicting the outcome of the 2008 election. You probably can't see the numbers very clearly, so let me just summarize them for you. These are 8 or 9, maybe 10 political scientists who have estimated statistical models to predict what's going to happen. And on average, they predicted the median forecast for McCain's share of the two-party vote in 2008 was 48%. This model here, the first one, by Alan Abramowitz, who's a political scientist at Emory, estimated that McCain would get 45.7% of the two-party vote in 2008. He did that on the basis of the approval rating of the president, some indicator of the performance of the economy. He uses second quarter GDP, and whether or not the party is seeking a third term in office. So if you just know those three things, if that's all you knew right before that election cycle, you could have predicted that McCain would get 45.7% of the popular vote, okay, which is important since we know we don't elect presidents by the popular vote, but there's usually a close correspondence. McCain's actual share of major party support was 46.8% in that election cycle, right? And if I can go back to this slide, what this column says is that this forecast was produced 69 days before the election. So this is before the debates, this is before any last-minute shenanigans. Many of these models, many of which also came very close to projecting the outcome, were estimated 3-4 months before the conventions, sometimes even before the candidates are even known. And that's because election outcomes are not only a function of the candidates and what happens in the campaign, they're a function of what we call fundamentals. What's going on with the economy, what's going on with other big picture things that can be captured through various variables and various measures. And if you put these things into a statistical model, you can do fairly well in predicting the outcome of an election. In 2008, amongst these models, only one was predicting a McCain victory in the popular major party vote. Okay? Most of them predicted an Obama victory in 2008 long before the election, and that's ultimately what happened. Whoops, going in the wrong direction. As I said, all you needed to know is these three things, and this model from Abramowitz has accurately predicted presidential winners of the popular vote since 1988 and has only made 4 mistakes if you run the model backwards since 1948. Some of these elections were very close, could have gone either way or otherwise idiosyncratic. The average margin of error for this model has been 1.5 percentage points, which is half of the final Gallup poll measure, right? So Gallup takes a poll the night before the election. It's twice as wrong as Abramowitz's model estimated 69 days before the election, right? That's how good these models are. If you look at 2008, the models were a little bit more mixed. Many of them predicted a Republican victory, although we know that didn't happen. Abramowitz predicted that Obama would get 50.6% of the two-party vote. I'm forgetting exactly how much of the two-party vote Obama got in 2012, but he did win, so the prediction was correct. So, what are the 2016 models saying? Well, the estimates have not yet been published, but the editor of the symposium that's going to release these in 2 weeks was nice enough to send me this chart so I can share it with you this evening. It shows you some of the same authors, the same political scientists using the same type of models. To make a long story short, 2 of these models are predicting that Trump will get, that Trump will win, okay, or get more, will win the two-party major vote. 6 of these are predicting that Clinton will win the major party vote. 3 are too close to call. But the median forecast for Clinton's support in the major party popular vote is 51.1%. Now, if you look closely at these numbers, they're really close. And when the numbers are that close, that's when campaigns might actually matter. That's when anything that happens on the campaign trail or any other idiosyncratic, non-systematic factor can tip the scales one way or another, or depending on what happens in specific states, battleground states, etc., that can determine the outcome. Okay, so they are pretty close, but they're usually pretty close. And one thing that causes me to be a little, or, you know, one thing that we can point out is that the Abramowitz model is one of the 2 that predicts that Clinton will not get a majority of the two-party vote. He predicts that Clinton will get 48.6% of the two-party popular vote, although he has said that he believes that his prediction will be wrong because of the idiosyncratic nature of Donald Trump. But this is what the rest of these models are saying, and so if you're a Clinton supporter, this might be good news, but it's probably a little too close for comfort on many different levels. But for what they're worth, this is what they are. And just for the heck of it, if you're interested in forecasts for what's going to happen in the House and Senate, we have 4 models here that have been used to examine what happens or that have been used to estimate what's going to happen in Congress. In all cases, Democrats seem to have an advantage when it comes to predicted seat change in the House and in the Senate. One model showing that Democrats may have as many as ability to pick up as many as 32 seats in the House and as many as 7 seats in the Senate, which of course would give them control of the Senate. So, okay, that gives you a sense of where things might be going in November and some observations about what may have gotten us there in the first place. I'm happy to entertain any questions, but appreciate this opportunity to think through this very exciting and somewhat tumultuous presidential cycle.
Yes. Researchers contact citizens who identify as Middle Eastern or the Islamic faith. Do they count them as, are they affiliated with like perception of being a white person or being a person, a non-white person?
Generally speaking, those are considered religious classifications. And I mean, researchers are not the ones that are classifying them. They are classifying themselves.
They do research the person's self.
That's right. So any survey research is going to be based on self-identification. So it's a very interesting question, but it's a matter of how the person sees themselves. So there could be people of Muslim faith who see themselves as white, maybe as non-white. I'm not sure where they would place themselves, but it's up to each individual respondent to place themselves in a racial category. Yes?
Thank you. My name is Dr. Edward Powers. My question has to do with political bosses. I live 2 blocks from here on McKinley, and you know, in the late 1800s in Buffalo, New York, Hannon was the political boss, and he picked who would be, you know, coming up next. And you go through the 30s, you have Ed Flynn in the Bronx, and it's even reported in the Kennedy election that Mayor Daley was able to deliver the votes.
Yeah.
So in this election, are there political bosses, and are there people who can, quote unquote, deliver the votes? Thank you.
Well, there are party leaders, right? But the day of party bosses, particularly in national politics, I would say there's been a considerable erosion, right? And that has been evident in this election cycle, especially on the Republican side, in terms of the party's ability to come together and coalesce around some candidate, right? Any candidate. They just couldn't do it. And even when the writing was on the wall that if they don't do it, it's going to be Donald Trump, and even people who had concerns about that weren't able to get it together and to find some alternative that people could get behind. So that might say something about the Republican Party, the nature of the party and fragmentation within that party, which I think is an important thing to think about. But it also says something about the changing nature of politics in America, right? Speaking of bosses, I remember Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall fame used to say, I don't care who votes as long as I can do the nominating, right? They just wanted to pick the nominees because they knew that in the general election people would just vote their party ID, and the real action was in the primaries, and if they were able to get their candidates through the nominating process, they had a good chance of winning the general election. Well, I think that still happens to a great extent in local elections and even some state and municipal level elections. But at the national election level, I think it's getting harder and harder for a lot of reasons, right? One reason is we see many more primaries and more people voting in primaries than we did in the past. We also see that technology and the ability of candidates to acquire to procure the kind of services that parties used to provide on their own has become enhanced. So it used to be the case that if you were a candidate, you had to rely on the political party to mobilize voters and do the polling for you and raise your money for you and print the lawn signs and go out and put the bumper stickers on the cars and get people to work for your campaign. Now candidates do that on their own. They don't need the political parties. They don't need the bosses. They put up a website. They attract their own supporters, their own volunteers. They collect their own money. They hire their own consultants. They make their own ads. They print their own signs. And they can do everything that the parties used to do for them on their own. So it has really diminished the role that parties and by extension bosses or party leaders, the candidates just don't need them as much anymore. And it has caused their power to decline in serious ways. Yes?
This kind of brings us back to the party decides thesis, right? So I've heard it suggested that the party decides thesis is really more about negative pressures than about positive. That is, the party at least can't just pick whoever they want as a nominee, but they can make things very difficult, perhaps impossible, for a candidate that they do not find acceptable. So here's my question. Do you think, in the case of the Trump nomination, that it was more significant that Republican Party elites did not coalesce against Trump? Or do you think it's more that Republican primary voters have just come to distrust their party elites to such an extent that they didn't really care what they had to say?
Well, I think it's probably a bit of both, right? And I agree with you, the premise of your question about negative and positive pressure. I think that's definitely true. But what I think has happened on the Republican side this year is that you had such an abundance of candidates, right? Everybody's favorite flavor, candidate was in the race. And so in a race like that, a candidate can win by getting only a little bit more of the vote. So a candidate like Donald Trump, who manages to only get, 25, 30% of the vote, is still huge compared to what these other candidates were getting, because they were splitting the other 75% amongst, 10 or 15, 12, 13 people. So part of it is just that the party didn't get together to narrow down the field of candidates before the election actually got going. I think that did happen to some extent early on when people like Scott Walker dropped out and so, but it didn't happen quickly enough in the early voting states to enable somebody to start picking up traction, get the kind of media attention, and raise the kind of money that they needed. And from my perspective, I'm still shocked that we're not talking about a Bush-Clinton general election. I just don't understand how Jeb Bush, who had, to the extent that anyone had the party behind them and had the endorsements and had the money, over $100 million, it was Jeb Bush. And he could not translate that into more than single-digit % in support at the polls, in the polls or at the polls, right? So to me, that was very surprising. And as I said earlier, I think some of the explanations include the fact that Donald Trump just sucked all the media attention away from the other candidates. They just could not get the kind of traction that he got in the press, and that really influenced how people perceived him as a candidate and how they assessed the nature of the race. Yes?
One of your slides indicated that there was a large number that made a decision very early on when the groups declared who was running or the candidates. They would make a decision. There was a very small percentage that decided day of election, some that 2 weeks out, I believe, was the period. Obviously, that's a very important group now, maybe 10 or 11%. And when we're predicting very close race, who are those people? What's the characteristic or profile of that 2 week and day of group?
Well, it might surprise you. A lot of them are independents or people who don't really affiliate with one party or the other. They're your classic swing voters, right? But they also have other characteristics that I think are important. Many of them are highly educated. So these are not, and they're paying attention. These are thoughtful, educated people who are potentially legitimately torn, right? But also knowledgeable enough to be weighing the pluses and minuses of both candidates in a general election. And I think because of their high propensity to be these pure independents, then they would, if anything, have the profile of the pure independents I mentioned earlier, which is highly educated, middle-aged white men in the South and in the Midwest. So to me, that would be a good description of the profile of what a late deciding voter might look like. Yes?
When I take a look at some of the polls that come out, and there's a great deal of discussion about particular states, such as Pennsylvania, Florida, Colorado, Virginia. If Clinton took those states, she would win, perhaps regardless of the popular vote. Can you comment about that?
Well, she has an advantage in terms of the electoral vote, no matter how you slice it. So I've looked at this, but I haven't made a pretty picture about it. But the New York Times has made lots of pretty pictures about it. Here's how they put it. They look at what might happen in these battleground states and the current lay of the land. And if you follow these paths to victory, Clinton has 693 ways to get to 270 electoral votes, depending on what happens in these states. Donald Trump has a fair number of paths, but he's only got 315. So she's got twice as many paths to victory as he does. But he still has quite a few paths to victory, and there's a 2% chance of a tie. In which case, as you probably know, if no one gets to 270, then the least democratic thing of all happens, which is that the election ends up in the House of Representatives, and the incoming House will make that decision. And what's even less democratic than that is that each state only gets one vote. So California and Rhode Island will have the same say in who becomes president. You know, even though the populations are vastly different, they will have exactly the same voice, so to speak, in terms of who becomes president if that actually happens. So I know we like to, as social scientists, we like to dream about that happening, but it's frightening in so many other ways that I don't wish it upon us. Yes?
With this election this year, is there a difference in the number of people who are voting for a candidate rather than against?
Yes, everyone's voting against the candidate. Right? And I mean, there's such distaste for both of these candidates. It's at historic highs, right, in terms of favorability and trustworthy. I mean, it's just off the charts. Voters are more motivated by their dislike of the other candidate in this cycle than they are enthusiastic about their own candidate. Yes?
We had a friend who was firmly entrenched in voting. He said he was voting for Trump no matter what, until they had that incident with a soldier who was Muslim, and he said, that is not, and I'm not voting for Trump at all, no matter what. Now, every time he opens his mouth and he does something more outrageous, do people really change their votes? I mean, I know our friend did, but do people really look at that picture and say, this is the last straw, I'm not voting for him no matter what?
Yeah, well, there can be any number of points in this election cycle when voters might have said that about things Donald Trump has said and done, right? Or even things Hillary Clinton has said and done. I'm sure people weren't thrilled about her deplorables comment that basically wrote off half of Donald Trump's supporters, right? But the point I was trying to make with the slides on partisanship is when push comes to shove, these people are going to be more influenced by their partisanship than anything else. And my guess is that many of those voters, maybe not all of them, but many of them will eventually fall in line with their partisan predispositions on Election Day. So maybe enough of them will actually switch, but to the extent there are switches, they're probably going to be almost equal in magnitude and may end up canceling each other out. Most people are still going to be guided very strongly by their partisan identification. Yes?
And can you say a few words about gender, the possibility of the first woman as president? How much is that a motivator?
Well, I've been surprised by how little a motivator it seems to have been in this election cycle, and I wonder if it has something to do with the fact that this potential election of the first woman president is coming right on the heels of the historic election of the first black president, right? It's good to keep making history, right, and keep breaking these glass ceilings. But at the same time, I think there was a lot of enthusiasm in 2008 for breaking that barrier with the first African American elected to the White House. I think that maybe because of that, there's a little less enthusiasm. Plus, the fact that although Hillary Clinton has an advantage, a big advantage amongst women, it's not huge. It's not overwhelming. There are a lot of women in this country who are not going to support her, either because of their partisanship or for other reasons, but there's not this huge level of support amongst women in support of her candidacy like there was amongst African Americans for Barack Obama, right? Actually, African Americans are more enthusiastic about her candidacy than women are about her candidacy. So I think that it will motivate a fair number of women and a fair number of even men who want to see this glass ceiling be broken. But it's not necessarily fueling the kind of enthusiasm in her candidacy one might expect. Yes, sir.
Could you say something, please, about the so-called millennials? They're supposedly not supporting Mrs. Clinton as much as they did President Obama. can they indeed vote for the Libertarian Party? How does
Well,
that fit to the...
millennials will end up supporting Hillary Clinton. 50% of them say that they're independent, but when you press them, most of them are Democratic or lean Democratic. And they may not be thrilled because a lot of them supported Bernie Sanders and they haven't gotten over that yet. But, and some of them won't vote because of that, and they might vote for Johnson or Stein or whatever, but most millennials, my expectation is that most millennials will end up, who end up voting, will end up voting for Hillary Clinton. Yes?
So a lot has been made of the socioeconomic and cultural factors of some of the Trump supporters. And it reminds me of the way mixed and silent majority was characterized, or making Democrats were characterized. Is this the modern day version of that trend? Working class whites going back and forth between parties?
Well, you can see some element of that. But I also wouldn't dismiss or underestimate the number of affluent, educated Americans out there who are supporting Donald Trump. Now, that might be because they don't like Hillary Clinton, and for a lot of them that is the case. But I think that there are many high socioeconomic status Americans out there who find many of the things that he says to be consistent with their points of view on taxes, on all kinds of issues. So I think that there is an element of what you're talking about, but it's not just that. I don't think he would have been able to come this far if it were just that segment of the electorate. Yes?
If I may ask another question. It's very interesting where you showed Trump and how he captured the media with these different things. Okay, and if you follow that to its logical conclusion, do you have an opinion about who mailed in his tax return?
Well, if I do have an opinion about it, I'm not going to share it with you. Because I don't know. I just don't know. But, you know, I think that there's something to be said for his mastery of how to use the media to his advantage, and he's doing that over and over again. There was a quote that I didn't put up from his Art of the Deal because it's been so overused, but it's something along the lines of, you know, even bad publicity is good publicity, and he clearly believes that. Because no matter what, you know, outrageous thing he might say, he's getting attention for it. And he's in people's living rooms every night. And I think that's one of the reasons he's been able to do as well as he has, because people knew him and felt familiar with him because he had been in their living rooms for a decade on a television show, a reality show, and people feel they know him. They feel they know how he thinks. They feel they know how he acts. He was in a position of power and authority, and that is translating into, I mean, that accrues some credibility for him, I think, as a presidential candidate that someone without that experience may not have had. Jackie.
Are you getting any feedback on what the rest of the world is thinking about our two candidates, the mess that's going on now?
Well, no more feedback than anyone else is getting, and no more than I'm getting in my own travels to other parts of the world where people are very concerned. And I think one of the reasons they're concerned is because the snippets of Donald Trump that they're getting in their media are no more than the most controversial, the most outlandish things that he says, and the kinds of things that he's been expressing support for that causes them to be concerned. But I don't know how fair and comprehensive a perception of Donald Trump and his candidacy that is, right? People in the rest of the world get, and through the internet, they're getting more of this, but I don't know that they get a thorough view. I mean, they're not vetting these candidates the way that we're vetting them. I mean, this has been going on here for years, right? Literally longer than a year, and we have an opportunity to get to know these candidates very well, get to know their positions. Not that everybody does, but certainly better than many people in other parts of the world do. Those people, world leaders, etc., who may have a clearer sense, seem to be expressing greater concern than the average publics in these places. But that's only anecdotal, secondhand information from what we're seeing in reports about this. Yes.
Do you think any what's happening with Putin and Syria will have any effect on how people vote?
I think it'll have some effect because foreign policy and Syria and Russia and concerns about our status in the world, etc., are an important issue, but it ranks only somewhere 4th or 5th or even lower in the list of priorities. Overwhelmingly, the top priority is the economy. Now, it generally is, but in this election cycle as well, the economy is the most important issue. And then terrorism and ISIS national security issues are a second, but it's in most polls not even a close second, right? It's about half as important as the economy is. And healthcare and other issues like immigration remain important as well. So I think a lot of people do care about that, but generally speaking, unless we're involved in a crisis or a war, foreign policy does not dominate the issues that galvanize or that influence voting in presidential elections. It's usually a lower level issue. Yes?
Do you think there's a relationship between the rise in the racial divide and the emergence of the Black Lives Matter with Trump's campaign?
With Trump's what?
Campaign.
Do I think that Trump's campaign is causing this? I think it's more likely to be a product of it than a cause of it. I mean, I don't have evidence about that. But I think that these, as I said, I think the groundwork for those tensions has been laid long before Donald Trump. If anything, I think he's taking advantage of it to do as well as he did, or to take advantage of that, the identity politics and racial resentment, which we have to acknowledge exists in this country. You know, I don't know that his rhetoric has helped that very much, but I don't think it has caused it. Yes?
Assuming that perhaps Clinton will win the election, what's your point of view about what's going to happen to Donald Trump afterwards?
It's a good question. The last thing I want to do is get in Donald Trump's mind and try to figure out what's going on there. I don't know that I'd be very good at that, you know. But I can see him taking a loss like that very personally and very seriously, and I can see him being a thorn in the side of many politicians, including Hillary Clinton, for a very long time. He tends to not let go of these gripes very easily. So I expect that he may remain a player on the political scene for quite some time, and he's got the resources and the popularity to do that. And I'm not so sure that's a bad thing, because as he's pointed out over and over again in this campaign, he has managed to attract the attention of people who would otherwise be totally tuned out of the political process. And whether we agree with those people or not, they have a right to be as vocal and as involved as the rest of us. And if you know, I mean, it's not great that this is what it takes to get them involved, but at the end of the day, there could be some positive consequence of greater involvement in politics writ large in this country, and you know, maybe we'll have Donald Trump to thank for that, at least partly. Well, thank you very much. This has been very great. should really take a page from Donald Trump and not lose an opportunity for a shameless self-promotion here. So if you're interested in more information about these things, I have 2 books published this year on these topics, and there's a lot more fleshed out about the things I said in these, so feel free to order them on Amazon.